What the hell? I'm gonna do another one. So, this one's gonna be a little bit longer than the last one. So hopefully I don't make a lot of fuck-ups. We'll see. This is going to be at the patio door. Rick Collum stood on his patio, looking down at the doormat that read, "Be neat. Wipe your feet," in big blocky letters. Right between the A and T of the word neat, there sat a mushy-looking red and white ball, and Rick knew at once that Felix had placed it there. Felix was his cat. He had not named the cat himself. In fact, he had argued that Felix was an extremely cliché name for a cat, but his wife, Melanie, had put her foot down on the matter. He hadn't even wanted a cat in the first place. Melanie had put her foot down on that matter as well. She insisted Felix would be good practice for the young couple before they had a real baby, a starter kid, she had told him. Think of it like a fuzzy toddler with training wheels. So Rick had caved, and they picked up a kitten from the local shelter, a mostly black and white shorthair, with splotches of blonde fur sprinkled here and there. And Rick grew to love the cat, and the cat grew to tolerate Rick. Rick's backyard was heavily wooded. It sat on 10 acres of forest land dominated by evergreens, with an occasional cottonwood scattered in like a giant yellow typo amongst a sea of emerald text. The nearest house was 600 yards down the quiet, scarcely used street that ran past Rick's old Victorian-style home. This all gave Felix plenty of space to prowl around, hunting little animals whilst pretending he was a jaguar in the jungle and not just an ordinary kitty. From time to time, he would leave a mouse head or the half-eaten carcass of a sparrow at the patio door. Rick found Felix's fleshy feline offerings to be sweet in a grotesque and morbid kind of way. It was almost as if the mutilated little critters were his cat's way of saying thank you for cleaning the litter box and filling his bowl with fancy feast every day. Whenever Rick would find one of Felix's gifts, he'd let out a deep, here we go again sigh, fetch his work gloves, and dispose of whatever was left of the unfortunate animal in the compost bin. But there was no frustrated sigh from Rick this time, and trudging off to the tool shed to grab his gloves barely seemed appropriate because once he realized what he was staring at, his body froze with dread. The mushy-looking red and white ball sitting between the A and the T on his doormat was actually a mushy-looking red and white ball with a green iris and a black pupil. Felix had delivered a human eye to the door. There were two reasons why Rick Collum was sure the blood-coated eyeball sitting on his porch had once belonged to a person, the first of which being humans have fairly unique eyes, at least compared to the animals that lived in the woods around his home. If Felix had brought back the eye of a dead deer or bobcat or coyote, Rick would have realized immediately that it was not humans. It might have been the wrong size or maybe an unnatural color. There were a multitude of tells that could have given this fact away to him, and even though he was no wildlife expert, he knew he could spot them. The second reason why he was sure the eye once belonged to a person was because he thought he recognized it. It looked just like Melanie's. And, Rick surmised, the chances were more than likely that it was hers. It wouldn't have been hard for Felix to find her corpse during one of his backyard jungle cat prowls, chew it from her face, and bring it back to the house. After all, Rick had slit her throat and dragged her body into the woods just 2 days prior. He believed that his mind had temporarily cracked the day he tossed her down in the snow next to the blue-tarp stack of firewood in the backyard and ground the serrated edge of his handsaw across the front of her throat. For Rick, going crazy hadn't been an instantaneous thing. It had taken weeks, perhaps even months, for him to reach that point. Sleepless nights dominated by angst-filled internal dialogues had warped his thoughts, Lurid red daydreams had beaten down his psyche. He was as mad as a loon when he murdered his wife, but the moment her blood trickled to the ground, mixing in with the slush like a cherry-flavored snow cone, he felt his sanity miraculously return. He had stood over her dead body that afternoon, fingers shaking not from the chill of the sharp winter air, but from shock, taken aback from himself, yet remarkably clear-minded for the first time in ages. Minutes later, he was lugging Melanie by her ankles through the forest behind their home. He stopped randomly about a quarter-mile into the labyrinth of Christmas trees, left her body at the base of a Douglas fir, and started back towards the house. Now, 2 days later, she had returned. At least part of her, anyway. Rick plucked the eyeball up from the porch and walked inside the house. He had never held an eye in his hand before, and he supposed he never would again. It was heavier than he expected, but just as squishy. He made a beeline straight for the kitchen sink, dropped it down the drain, and flicked a switch on the wall. The garbage disposal's blades roared to life. It was a hungry monster that dwelled just beneath the stainless steel basin where Rick sometimes peeled potatoes. It minced and chewed the eyeball to paste with whirling metal teeth and swallowed it down its crooked plastic neck. He wasn't trying to get rid of evidence. Rick was well aware that he would not be getting away with his wife's murder. Eventually, Melanie's mother would wonder why her daughter wasn't answering her calls and ask Rick's brother-in-law, who lived only an hour away, to drive down to the house to check on her. Or maybe it would be that drama queen Jamie Lynch, Melanie's bestie from the book club, who would become suspicious first and call the police. It didn't really matter. He had nowhere else to go. He didn't own a passport, and quite frankly, even if he did, he probably wouldn't have tried to flee. He was too tired to run. No, Rick was going to pay for his crime. He had accepted that. But he didn't want to be reminded of this fact in the last few days as a free man. All he wanted to do was pet Felix and watch sports on the couch. He flicked off the garbage disposal switch, and the monster beneath the sink went to sleep. Rick marched back across the house until he reached the oak-trimmed glass door that opened up to his patio. He tugged at the handle, cracking the door, and icy winter air invited itself into his living room. Rick stepped outside to see if Felix was around, but the cat was nowhere in sight. He called out his name a couple of times and even contemplated looking for him, but decided to retreat to the warmth of his heated home and make dinner instead. Felix would come back when he was good and ready. Sometimes his jungle prowls lasted all night. Besides, it was getting dark and he had a hankering for spaghetti. The following morning, Rick trudged downstairs in his PJs and brewed some coffee. Once it was hot and ready, he poured himself a cup, stirred in a teaspoon of sugar, then slogged sleepily through the living room as he sipped it. He stopped once he reached the patio door and peered through the glass to see if Felix was waiting on the porch to be let in. He was not, however, he did see something else sitting on the patio. It looked like uncooked bacon smothered in watery ketchup, and he hoped, as ridiculous as the idea sounded in his head, that it was, though deep down he knew this was not the case. Rick opened the door and strode outside to investigate. The wooden porch burned cold against his warm, naked feet. He bent down and picked up the fleshy thing between his finger and thumb. It was part of an ear. A sick feeling crept into his stomach, where it mingled with coffee and last night's spaghetti. Without a moment of hesitation, Rick rushed back inside and trotted into the kitchen, taking care not to spill from his mug, then fed the chunk of ear to the monster that lived beneath the sink. Rick would feed the monster the spaghetti from his stomach as well. 1 hot shower, 2 bouts of vomiting, and 3 swigs of Pepto-Bismol later, Rick was trekking through the woods towards the spot he had left his wife's body. He had a strange urge to see Melanie after finding her in pieces at his patio door. He was bundled up in a puffy North Face jacket that had fit him better when he was 20 pounds heavier. On his head, he wore an ugly knitted cap with an orange puffball at the top, and draped around his face was a Christmas-themed scarf that had cutesy pictures of elves embroidered into it. Mismatched mittens protected his hands from the biting cold, and baggy ski pants sagged awkwardly off his rear as if he was auditioning for a part in the stage production of Christmas with the Crips, a holiday Trout Boy musical. Melanie had purchased most of the clothes that he was wearing. When she was alive, Rick rarely had a say in when it came to his wardrobe. It had become commonplace for her to lay his outfit for the day on the bed by the time that he came out of the shower every morning. Now that she was dead, he realized he'd forgotten how to dress himself. Or maybe he just didn't care. What did it matter anyway? Soon enough, he'd be sporting a prison jumpsuit, probably for the rest of his life. The sun was out that morning, shining bright and ironic in the freezing winter sky. Snow crunched loudly beneath his boots, and birds in the trees above his head sang songs about a man who murdered his wife with a handsaw. Rick spotted Melanie's corpse 50 feet ahead of him. She was still lying at the base of the tree exactly like he left her, dead and nearly headless. The closer he got, the more he regretted setting off to find her. He wondered if it would be better or worse to see her face, Sen's eyes and ears, and whatever else Felix had managed to gnaw off. On one hand, such a sight might give him some macabre sense of closure. On the other, Rick didn't get the chance to finish his thought. Another one had bulldozed its way into his head, bullying the old one to the back of his mind. This new thought was, Jesus Christ. He was close enough to touch Melanie's body now. Her throat had lolled back unnaturally, and the open gash in the front of it made her resemble a human Pez dispenser. Her skin was black and blue, frostbitten from the cold, but her face was still intact, even more so than he had expected it would be. She was not missing an ear, nor was she missing an eye. She was, however, missing the 8.5-month-old fetus that had been gestating in her uterus when Rick sawed her throat in half earlier that week. The jacket Melanie was wearing had been torn to shreds. Her sweater underneath was but a web of tattered cotton ribbons. Melanie's swollen stomach splayed open as if a hand grenade had went off inside it. Felix had not been the one to dissect her. It would have been impossible for a house cat to do such a thing, no. Some other animals had gotten to Rick's wife, wolves or coyotes, he assumed. The baby she was carrying was gone, most likely dragged off and devoured by the scavengers of the forest. An appalling thought then popped inside Rick's head. The body parts that had turned up at his patio door had belonged to his unborn son and not his wife. He had green eyes, just like Melanie. The words bore into his mind like an earthworm. Rick doubled over and began to heave. There was no spaghetti dinner this time. He had given it all to the monster beneath the kitchen sink. The only thing that came out was Pepto-Bismol. It tasted the same coming up as it did going down, and it turned the snow at his feet bright pink. The baby was the reason he had killed Melanie. During the last few years of their marriage, Rick had come to hate his wife. He was working up the nerve to leave her before she announced her pregnancy to him. Came as a terrible surprise. Melanie was supposed to be on birth control at the time. She told him the child had been a gift from God, which Rick found odd since he had never known her to be the religious type. He suspected she had secretly stopped taking her pills. Rick pleaded with her to get an abortion. He told her that he was too busy for kids. In truth, he knew a child would make cutting all ties with Melanie impossible, and when he finally did divorce her, he wanted to ensure that he was completely done with her. But Melanie had made up her mind. She would be having their baby with or without his blessing. This was yet another matter she had put her foot down on. And so, just like with the cat, Rick had caved, and together the two bought a crib, converted his office into a nursery, and did all the other things young couples do when they're expecting their first child. According to their OB, the baby would be a boy with a late December due date. Might be a Christmas baby, she had said. Shortly after that was when the crazy thoughts began flooding Rick's head. 8.5 months later, they finally went away, and all it took was a rusty old handsaw and a few buckets of blood on a cold winter afternoon. There was nothing left for him to see. Rick wiped the remaining pink slime from his lips and started his short hike back towards the home. The birds overhead were still whistling their tunes, but now they sung of a baby ripped from his dead mother's womb and torn to shreds by hungry, ravenous animals. Rick's brains felt like scrambled eggs. He wondered if the baby was still alive while it was being eaten, then decided he'd rather not know the answer to that, and pondered other questions instead. Was there anything left of his little son out there, hidden under the white sheet of icy slush that blanketed the forest floor? Bones, perhaps? It must have been something, Rick assumed. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been finding little bits of baby on his porch. A powerful sense of guilt swept over him. Melanie might have been a bitch, but his little boy didn't deserve what had happened. The trees were silent evergreen spectators, rising out of snowy earth. They stopped abruptly 20 yards from Rick's home, circling carefully around it, as if they were afraid to root themselves in the soil where Melanie's murder had taken place. Rick's journey had left him fatigued, more mentally taxed than physically exhausted, but still, he felt like he needed to rest, to lay his head down, to close his eyes. And he aimed to do all those things as soon as he got inside the house. His backyard was an icy desert in the middle of a wintry green paradise. He lumbered through the last of the trees and across the inverted oasis. The slush beneath his feet seemed tainted. It looked gray and hoary, like an ashtray. Dead, even. If it were possible for ice to appear that way. He halted, suddenly, when the toe of his boot kicked something hard and rigid, sticking out of the snow. It made a metallic clinking noise when his foot connected with it. Rick gazed down and noticed the handsaw he had used to kill his wife, staring up at him. He bent over and pulled it free from the slush. He had not held it in his hand since that day. Its teeth were still stained red with Melanie's blood. The saw smiled at him like a satisfied glutton that had just enjoyed a great feast. Its grin was derisive. It mocked him. Rick spun around and flung the saw as hard as he could. He wasn't aiming for anywhere in particular. All he wanted was to make the damn thing go away, just as he had done with the eye and the ear. The handsaw spun through the air like a boomerang, and for the briefest of moments, Rick was afraid that, just like a boomerang, it might bend back around and make its way toward him again, grinning its red Cheshire cat grin. But the saw flew a straight course, sailing out of the yard and vanishing between the trees. Rick watched until it disappeared from sight. Then he turned back around and resumed his journey across the yard. He eyed his porch like the finish line at a marathon. It was 8 below freezing outside, but somehow Rick was sweating. He stumbled up the wooden steps and nearly fell flat on his face when his foot slipped on a patch of ice. Without so much as a thought, his hand reached out to grip the rail, and he managed to catch himself before spilling onto the deck. He paused at the top of the steps to get his bearings, and it was here that he noticed it, sitting neatly atop the doormat, like an uncooked cocktail sausage dipped in marinara sauce. The air rushed from his lungs so fast they felt like they were going to collapse in on themselves. He was looking at a human finger, and this time, he was sure it did not belong to his dead wife or his unborn son. The severed digit was too big to be a baby's and too masculine to have belonged to Melanie. It was thick and stubby and a little bit hairy. It had a cracked yellow nail at one end, and at the other was a gnarled mess of stringy pink flesh. The sight of it evoked a strong disgust in Rick, worse than the other body parts he had found on his patio, worse than the saw with the crimson grin, even worse than his wife lying in the snow, with her Pez dispenser neck and a belly like a lunar crater. Perhaps it was the uncertainty that revolted him so much. Where had the finger come from? There were no tracks in the snow around his patio, not even a single paw print. Stranger even, who had it belonged to? It was a question Rick couldn't even begin to fathom an answer for. Rick staggered towards the finger and snatched it from his doormat. There might have been a million questions streaming through his head, but the one thing he did know was that he needed it off his deck. He cocked his arm like a quarterback and chucked a Hail Mary towards the trees. The finger twirled end over end through the air before spiking itself nail side up in the snow a few feet from the place Melanie had taken her last desperate breaths. It hadn't made it to the forest like the handsaw had. Now it was sitting upright in the middle of his yard, like a miniature monument. Rick stared at it for a few uneasy seconds, contemplating whether or not to walk across the slush and give it another hurl, but eventually decided to let the finger stand in peace. It was supposed to snow later that afternoon, and fresh powder would have it covered up by the evening. He called out for Felix again, but the cat did not appear when he shouted his name, so Rick headed inside his living room and plopped himself down on his couch. He had only been awake for a couple of hours, but he was wiped. His eyelids were becoming heavy, and he could feel himself drifting off. But before the dreams took over, his mind conjured up one more thought. Something he had not yet considered. The body parts were all relatively fresh when he found them on the porch, but the weather outside was below freezing. Exposure for only an hour at that kind of temperature would have been enough to freeze flesh, rock, solid. Yet the eye had been squishy when he held it in his hand, and the ear and finger were both warm to the touch. It was an utterly insane conclusion to draw, but this sudden epiphany could only mean that the bits and pieces he had been finding were only just being delivered to his porch minutes before he arrived, and that whoever they were coming from were more than likely still alive and breathing when they had been removed. The revelation was not enough to pull him from sleep's relentless grasp. His body felt like it was sinking into the couch. Just a few minutes, he thought to himself. I'll turn my brain off for a few minutes, and then I'll figure out what the hell is going on. Rick would sleep for 3.5 hours. During that time, he would have a terrible nightmare, but he wouldn't remember any of it by the time he woke up. The first thing Rick expected to see when he opened his eye was the finger. It was there, still standing upright in his backyard like a tiny pink lawn dart. But something else, much more prominent, had managed to capture his attention. A black, white, and blonde ball of fur was curled up at the patio door. Rick sprung to his feet at the sight of it. His cat was home. He zipped across the living room in a flash and jerked open the door in the same perfunctory manner Kramer might have entered Jerry's apartment on Seinfeld. But the second he got a clear look at his kitty, he knew something was very wrong. The black, white, and blonde ball of fur curled up at the patio door was actually a black, white, blonde, and red ball of fur. And it wasn't moving. Felix was dead. Just as dead as his wife, dead as the gray, ashy slush that caked Rick's yard. Felix's body was twisted and coiled as if someone had wrung him out like a wet towel. Blood oozed like strawberry syrup from his mouth and eyes. Rick wanted to cry but couldn't. Maybe the cold had frozen his tear ducts. More than likely it was the horror swirling inside him that had put a stop to the tears. He was no longer in denial. It hadn't been Felix, or any other animal for that matter, leaving the body parts on his patio. Rick Cullum was being stalked. He touched a hand of Felix's fur. Still warm. The cat couldn't have been killed and placed at his door more than 20 minutes before he woke up. He scanned the yard with wild eyes, searching desperately for some sign of his stalker, but found nothing. Rick's hands were quaking with frustration. He almost screamed out at the trees, but swallowed it down before it could burst free from his mouth. The stalker was no doubt out there, watching him, waiting for him to crack. It was clear now that this mystery man had been playing a game with Rick, trying to elicit a certain reaction out of him. But he wasn't about to show that he was rattled. That was what the maniac wanted. He had to stay calm and collected until he could think of a plan. Rick scooped the poor cat up off the porch and carried him out into the middle of the yard. It was here that he would dig Felix's grave. He grabbed a shovel from the tool shed and went to work. The frozen ground was stubborn and unyielding at first, but Rick chiseled away at the icy upper crust with the edge of his spade until he reached the softer dirt below. The digging was far more. The digging was more for Rick than for Felix. Yard work helped him meditate. Back when his wife was alive, he had always used it as an excuse to steal away from her incessant nagging. His most peaceful moments had come when he was chopping wood or tending to the vegetable garden during the warm months. He was trying to relax now, but he could feel the eyes of the stalker studying him from the trees. He didn't know why he was being tormented. Perhaps the psychopath had been watching Rick and his wife for months. He wondered if it could all be some sadistic form of payback, punishment for what he had done to Melanie. His thoughts turned to her, how she had driven him to the brink of sanity, how she had tricked him into getting her pregnant. And then the idea struck him like a bolt of lightning. Oh God, the baby. Maybe it hadn't been animals that had torn his son from his dead wife's stomach. Maybe it was the stalker. Yes, that was it. The freak had somehow removed Rick's son before he could die in Melanie's womb, and now he was trying to drive Rick mad. He wants me out of the picture so he can raise the baby himself, he uttered under his breath. He knew now what he had to do. Rick was going to face this mystery man head on. If there was a chance his son was alive, he was going to rescue him from whoever this sicko was. After that, he would own up to his crime and call the police. The baby would most likely be handed over to Melanie's mother while Rick was in prison. She was well-to-do and not that old. The boy would have a good life. It wouldn't absolve Rick of his sins, but at least he could do something good with his last few hours as a free man. Rick spooned the last bit of dirt on top of Felix's grave and patted it down with the back of his shovel. The finger stood stoically mere feet from the plot, the sole mourner at the unfortunate cat's funeral. Rick tossed the shovel to the ground, then whirled around to face the trees. "I know you're out there," he said. "And I know you have my son." His voice was bold, but deep down he was terrified. He pointed to the living room. "I'll be waiting right there, on my couch. If you have any balls, you'll face me. Bring him with you. I'm not moving from that spot until you do." And with that, Rick marched inside and prepared for war. Rick Collum had never been to war before. If one were to overlook the Melanie incident, he hadn't even been in a fight since the 7th grade, when an older boy named Tommy Harper punched him in the gut for spilling his lunch tray all over the 8th grader's brand new Denver Broncos jersey after Rick tripped over a backpack in the school cafeteria. Rick had seen movies about war before. He went through a phase in college where he was into old Vietnam movies. He and his roommates had even gotten high one Friday night and watched Apocalypse Now 3 times in a row. This was not Vietnam or Cambodia, and he was not Captain Ben Willard or crazy-ass Colonel Kilgore. And he did not love the smell of napalm in the morning. In fact, he didn't even know what napalm smelled like. His home wasn't a conventional military stronghold. There was a fire burning in the fireplace, and his television was turned into a holiday music station that was currently playing through a Bing Crosby Christmas album. He was sitting on a pistachio-green leather sofa, and in his lap was a fire poker that he used to jab kindling when it needed help catching. It was his M1 carbine. Rick had no real gun. Melanie had never let him own a firearm, and he had no military training outside of what he had seen in old movies, but he readied himself and waited just the same. Charlie was hiding out somewhere in the woods, and he needed to stay alert. The sun had gone down hours ago, and snow was falling heavily. A few inches must have already come down because the finger was finally buried, and Rick's dead gray yard had been covered up by a layer of fresh powder. He felt like he had been sitting on the couch listening to holiday crooners forever. Rick began to wonder if his stalker would ever show, and for a second, he even doubted his sanity. Maybe his cracked mind had never really mended itself, and everything he had been experiencing tonight was all one big psychotic episode. But that theory didn't last too long, though. It melted away like a dead man's presence in a world that's ever moving, always forgetting. He was sane, all right. Rick saw it appear in the darkness. His eyes could just barely make it out, but there was definitely something outside, or someone, rather, standing at the edge of his yard, where the tree line began, the figure of a man. The man stood motionless, as if completely unbothered by the snowstorm that had rolled in. Rick squinted, trying to make out his features, but the night was dark, and the figure was just a black silhouette against a white backdrop. There was no denying what he was seeing, though. His stalker had arrived. Rick leaned forward in his seat, gripping the brass handle of the fireplace poker tight. He tried to swallow, but his mouth was dry. Something was very off about the man. There was an object in his stalker's hand. It was flat and rigid, and he couldn't tell what it was, but the sight sent a shiver down the back of Rick's neck. A rope of some sort hung from the man's waist, dangling down to his mid-thighs. Rick's baby was nowhere to be seen. A disappointed sigh slipped out from between his lips, and he felt his heart sink a little in his chest. He had been so sure the stalker would show up with his son. Now his chance at redemption was fluttering away on transparent wings. The shadowy figure began to move across the yard, and as it did, its shape grew larger. By the time the stalker reached Felix's grave, Rick could tell he was dealing with a very large man. The body advancing towards the house dwarfed Rick's much smaller frame. It was tall and broad, with thick arms, bulky thighs, and a torso like a mailbox. The stalker's features were beginning to take shape too, and now Rick could see that his mysterious pursuer wasn't wearing any clothes. It was both ridiculous and terrifying to see the massive naked man striding through the snow. Rick could tell that he was carrying in his hand now. It was the saw he had flung into the woods earlier that day. That damn thing was still grinning red. Bing Crosby's smooth baritone voice was flowing out of the television speakers. He was singing of sleigh bells and treetops and snow. The song was White Christmas. Once the giant naked man reached the base of the patio steps, his features had become as clear as day. The frightening spectacle made Rick jerk to his feet. He knew where the stalker had been getting the body parts that had been turning up at his door. Himself. One of his eyes was missing from his face, and it looked as if part of his ear had been torn off of the side of his head. Yet the most maddening thing about this man's face was not the disfigurements, but how hauntingly familiar it was. Rick was sure he had never met the nude behemoth before. There was no way he would have forgotten him if he had, but there was no shaking the feeling that he knew his face. Somehow he knew it. The man stomped up the porch's wooden stairs. His footsteps rattled the deck. He was built like an NFL lineman, with huge muscles hidden by a generous layer of fat. He reached the top of the deck, and Rick lowered his poker towards him as if he were wielding a spear. The glass patio door was the only thing separating the two. Rick glanced at the rope swinging freely between the depraved man's legs. His eyes trailed it upwards, and it wasn't until they reached the top that he realized it wasn't a rope at all. It was gray and fleshy, and it protruded from the stalker's doughy stomach like a growth. Wait! Rick couldn't believe what he was seeing. Was that an... There was no more time to finish his thought. The patio door burst open. In rushed a gust of icy air, but the cold air was not the only thing that entered Rick's living room. His stalker was now only a few feet away from him. Rick jabbed at him with the poker, but the hulking man knocked it away with a big, meaty paw, and it fell uselessly to the floor. With his other hand, he grabbed Rick by the collar of his shirt and shoved him to the sofa. Rick looked up at his attacker, and suddenly it came to him. He knew why the stalker's face was so familiar. It was his face, and Melanie's too, an amalgam of both of theirs. The man had Rick's nose and his dead wife's lips. His one remaining eye was the same color as hers, but damned if he didn't have Rick's chin. He glanced again at the fleshy rope hanging from his attacker's stomach, right where his belly button would be, a rope that had once been connected to Melanie's womb. And so he understood. The stalker had brought his son after all. The man wrapped a four-fingered hand around Rick's face and scowled at him. There was a hateful look in his eye. Rick was sure he would have cursed him if he could talk, but unborn babies don't know how to speak English. A few days ago, Melanie had been carrying his son in her belly. But now, that baby was a grown man, a very large grown man, and he was standing over Rick in his living room, palming his face like a basketball. He raised the saw to Rick's neck. Rick understood then that it was vengeance that had come for him. He would not be getting the redemption that he had been seeking. No, redemption would be... No, retribution would be had instead. And it would be had at his expense. He was about to be punished for his selfish crimes, for ending the life of his baby before it had even begun. And who better to wreak vengeance on him than his son himself? Rick didn't feel the need to question how what was happening was even possible. His mind was sound, that much he knew, but thinking about the ins and outs of what he was witnessing might have caused it to crack again. And he didn't want to die a madman. The teeth of the saw felt cold against his skin. The grinning glutton was ready to feast again, and feast it would. Bing Crosby's Christmas album was still playing on the TV. The famous crooner's soothing voice blended seamlessly in the air with Rick's screams. He sang of calling pipes and mountainsides, of summer meadows, and bleeding throats. Well, that was certainly something. This stupid thing keeps getting in my way. All right. Well, thank you all for watching again. And oh, thank y'all. I do so love to read stories. It soothes me too. I fall asleep to like Rainbot and Nexpo and all those types of people all the time. I love that type of content. All right. I am going to get some sleep so that I can get everything done for tomorrow. Thank you all for watching and for all of your kind comments. And we will have one of these very soon. So have a great night.